Okay, so we're going into the second part. I have the PowerPoint for Chapter 11 divided up into 3 sections, and then each one is further divided up into smaller lectures. Trying to chunk the information up so we can get all this stuff in. So for this particular PowerPoint, the learning objectives that apply to it are to be able to state where each of the specific sensory tracts start and end, and what type of information is transmitted in each tract. So we talked about overall the conscious, divergent, and non-conscious relay tracts, and now we're going to talk about the individual tracts within those tracts. And then what part of the brain does sensation have to travel to for crude awareness? So important learning objectives. Also, we're going to I want you to be able to describe the 3 steps in the sensation experience. So we've talked about sort of 2 of them so far. The first one is the encoding of information by the peripheral sensory receptors. The second part is taking that information from the spinal cord to the thalamus or the central nervous system. And the third part is the primary somatosensory cortex interpreting that information. So the difference between discriminative touch and conscious proprioception, we're going to define that. And then we want to be able to compare spinothalamic pain to spinolimbic pain in terms of speed, localization, and quality of pain. Which one of these things travels faster and why it travels faster. So nociception, temperature, and crude touch all travel in the anterolateral columns. So we talked about light touch traveling in the dorsal column. Nociception, temperature, and crude touch are traveling in the anterolateral columns. There are 2 types of pathways that convey signals in the anterolateral column. One of them is part of the conscious relay pathways that we talked about in the last section, and the other one is part of the divergent pathways. So signals for fast nociception travel in a conscious relay pathway. Signals for slow nociception that reach conscious awareness travel in the spinolimbic or spinal emotional pathway, which is a divergent pathway. The spinothalamic pathway, and its name tells you where it goes to and from. It goes from the spine to the thalamus. So in order for us to consciously perceive sensation, it has to go to the thalamus. So any pathway that has thalamic in it is a conscious pathway. That gives you a clue right there. So the spinothalamic pathway gives us discriminative, fast nociception, temperature, and crude touch. Temperature and crude touch signals use different neurons in the same pathway. The first order neuron, whether it's that A delta fiber nociception, the A beta fiber temperature, or the A delta fiber for crude touch, the first order neuron brings information into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, just like the other ones we've talked about. The second order neuron, the axon crosses the midline and projects from the spinal cord to the thalamus. And the third order neuron projects from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So all of our sensory pathways are going to have those 3, it's going to be that 3 neuron pathway. So it's good to know where each one goes. So that crossover thing, where it crosses the midline, that's going to come into play when we start talking about the spinal cord injuries and that sort of thing, and CVAs, how the body is affected depending on where it crosses over. And I've had students in the past ask me, well, why does it cross over? We don't know why it crosses over. We just know that it does. So there's no why about it, I guess. It's observed that it does, and we just have to live with that. But it does help us identify the location of a lesion, so that's handy. So the first order neuron in the spinothalamic pathway, it's the peripheral axon brings that impulse into the dorsal root ganglion. For discriminative temperature information, warm and cold are detected by specialized free nerve endings of small, myelinated and less myelinated neurons. Even though it says unmyelinated, we can think of them as less myelinated. Crude touch conveys non-light touch information. So light touch was those A betas. Crude touch is all the other touch, non-light touch, like tickle and itch maybe. The second and third order neurons in the spinothalamic pathway, the cell body of the second order neuron is in the dorsal horn. Most spinothalamic tract neurons end in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. Do you need to know that? No. All you need to know is that it ends in the thalamus. And the pathway name gives you that, spinothalamic, from the spine to the thalamus. The third order neurons arise in that ventral posterolateral nucleus in the thalamus and project to primary and secondary sensory cortex, which is going to interpret that information. So I like to think of the thalamus. Somebody last quarter in one of their assignments mentioned the movie Osmosis Jones, which is a silly movie for sure. But there is some good information in it, directed towards grade school level kids. But one of the things in the movie, the thalamus, the brain or the cerebrum is the boss, like the executive, and the thalamus is the executive assistant of the boss. So the boss's executive assistant gets to decide what information goes to the boss and what information doesn't. So in the spinothalamic pathway, the second order neuron goes from the dorsal horn of the spinal cord up to the thalamus, and the thalamus then gets to decide if it's going to send that information to the brain. If the brain is busy with a bunch of other stuff, the thalamus might just keep it to itself and just say, we don't need to know that right now, or the boss doesn't need to know that right now. If the boss is available, then they might pass on the information. So, and it passes on that information via the third order neurons to the primary and secondary sensory cortex. And the primary and sensory cortex, they process the information and decide what we're going to do with it. So the fast nociceptive system is also known as the lateral nociceptive system because of that ventral posterolateral nucleus in the thalamus. That's why it's called the lateral nociceptive system. But a lesion in that thalamic nucleus interrupts the pathway to the cortex. So that gives you the inability to localize noxious stimuli. So you need that information in the fast nociceptive pathway. Remember when we were talking about pain last quarter and we said with acute pain it's highly localized? It's using this fast nociceptive pathway to localize that information. It's conscious nociception. And we're always asking people when we're deciding where we're going to put the electrodes for E-stim, we say, well, where does it hurt the most? Point to the one spot where it hurts the most. We need the information in this lateral nociceptive system to be able to localize pain. So that chronic widespread pain is harder to localize, and so it's coming from other pathways. It's not coming from this one. So the dorsal column medial lemniscus is one pathway to the brain. The spinothalamic pathway is another pathway to the brain. The spinothalamic and dorsal column systems are anatomically similar, meaning they go from the dorsal horn of the spinal cord to the brain, but they are different in the information they carry. The spinothalamic tract contains axons that transmit information about nociception, temperature, and crude touch. The dorsal columns contain the information about light touch and conscious proprioception. So that having been said, the functions of the dorsal columns and the spinothalamic tract are not rigidly segregated. They share some function, they share some information. So we know the primary information that travels in those columns, but there is some crossover. The divergent pathways, they have projection neurons in the anterolateral columns. If someone breaks a bone in their hand, for example, the divergent nociceptive pathways provide information that contribute to automatically directing the eyes and head toward the injury. The information is not well localized, so the entire hand seems to hurt. So the conscious nociception that's coming in the spinothalamic fast pathways, it gives you specific localized information. The divergent pathway information is not well localized, and so it gives you sort of more widespread pain. And we'll talk more about that in the next section.